Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. It just occurred to me that from the shallows to the depths would be basically the way my husband sees moving from political science to philosophy. About 3 years ago, my husband and I started a low-tech initiative for families that we dubbed the Postman Pledge, named after Neil Postman, media critic and educator. The goal of the group was to promote friendship in a non-digital way through face-to-face interaction at gatherings like dances and picnics and game nights, but also through a kind of continuing cultural formation for parents. So we had and have 2 tracks. In fact, Leslie Rice is speaking for our cultural track next week. One of our lectures and discussions was on gender ideology, and it was given by a fellow named Jay Richards, whom many of you know. Jay was asked, why did you leave the relative peace and security of the academy, especially a business school, to work in the trenches of the gender war? And he said something that I don't think I will ever forget, because he said transgenderism represents a civilizational crisis. And he thought that he had to join the ranks. It was worth fighting for. It was a hill worth dying on. Yes, transgenderism does represent a civilizational crisis, but I would argue that it's only an epiphenomenon. The heart of the crisis is not transgenderism or any of these fights we might have about very important things. Rather, the crisis is a crisis of meaning, provoked by and exacerbated by digital technology. This is a complicated relationship, but I hope to explore some of it. But first, before delving into this cheerful topic of civilizational crisis at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, we're going to play a game. We're going to play charades, okay? The first one is an event. So, okay. The zombie apocalypse. Okay. The next is a condition. Okay. University of Maryland students walking across Route 1. Or if we wanted to add 5 more, in peril of their lives. Both are zombie apocalypses. The first is an honest one. There are good guys and there are bad guys. The zombies are invading. They are a hostile force. In the second, we invited the zombies in. We paid them to come handsomely, and we willingly became infected. Neil Postman, writing in 1985, warned of just such a cultural pandemic. And his words are worth quoting at length. This is actually extraordinary. We were keeping our eye on 1984. When the year came and the prophecy didn't, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we at least had not been visited by Orwellian nightmares. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly less well-known, equally chilling: Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression. But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists, who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny, failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. And this talk is about the certainty that Postman was right. The picture Neil Postman painted in 1985 was grim, and not only because it was the year of my sophomore prom. It's grimmer now. Postman was writing before the widespread use of the desktop, before personal computers, before laptops, before the iPad, nearly 25 years before the iPhone. And basically what you had was Love Boat and an automated typewriter, and I used both. A revolution has taken place, and it has precipitated a civilizational crisis as serious as a zombie apocalypse, because it is effectively a zombie apocalypse. The great medium, small, indeed ever smaller, facilitating this revolution is a device, the smartphone, because it's the great impediment to a profound education that I face, and I suspect that you face. That will be the main focus of the presentation. Because of the phone, in addition to other digital technologies, we are becoming increasingly unable to think. The social science evidence of the negative effects of digital saturation is overwhelming. I'll turn to Nicholas Carr for a measure of the cognitive effects of this. In the second edition of The Shallows, published in 2020, Carr writes that 80% of adults and 95% of young adults have smartphones. So 4 years ago, according to various studies, and he seems to me to be a very competent reader of social science, they spend an average of 6 hours a day on their phones. So this does not include other uses of digital media. Those 6 hours are typically divided 85 times. So you have roughly a 30-second session on your phone when you check in, or as it were, check out. So from sunup to sundown, people have checked their phones impulsively. Carr says that there are extraordinary and measurable cognitive penalties, is the way he phrases it, to the use of these devices. In a University of California, San Diego, and Harvard study, cognitive psychologists studied 500 undergraduates at UCSD. They measured 2 standard tests of intellectual acuity, what they called a working memory capacity and another that measures what they call fluid intelligence. The first gauges the mind's capacity to focus on tasks, the second to interpret and solve unfamiliar problems. Okay, there was only one variable in this study, namely the location of the students' smartphones. In one group, the phones were off, but on their desks, face down. In the second group, they were stowed, also off, in their pockets. And in the third group, the phones were left in a different room. The results were striking. On both tests, subjects whose phones were in view, though off, fared the worst. Those whose phones were stowed elsewhere fared best. And those who were out of sight, those who were out of sight but close were in the middle. Carr cites a number of studies, and they have just extraordinary findings. In the end, he concludes that the phone in particular has an extraordinary power. I mean, I would say that it would make Prometheus blush. It would make the theft of Prometheus look like a misdemeanor. This power, mysterious, but nevertheless very real, to undermine our capacity to think well. But it also has an extraordinary power to undermine our capacity to feel well. Social science evidence for the negative psychological effects of the phone and social media use is also overwhelming. Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, is only one such narrative. But it's a powerful one, and thankfully it's getting a lot of attention. He maintains that beginning in the 2010s, with the widespread adoption of the smartphone by children and adolescents, we see a corresponding surge in the rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide, and less dramatically, sleep deprivation, a fragmentation of attention, loneliness, addiction, social contagion, and social comparison. The anecdotal evidence for this abounds. What do? We are swimming in this. Nay, we are drowning in a sea of digital stimuli that is trivial, if not toxic. Our minds are subject to unrelenting distraction. So how do we educate in such a context? It strikes me that we have to see the problem, as David Lewis Schindler Sr. would have said, also known as Grandpa. We have to see the problem as an ontological one, not just a moral one. If every Facebook post and every tweet were edifying, we'd still be in the zombie apocalypse. Why? Because the medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan said so long ago. Postman, a student of McLuhan's, observed, there is a profound connection between forms of human communication and the quality of a culture. Forms of communication regulate and even dictate, he says, what kind of content can issue from such forms. And I'd like to recur to the text again. To take a simple example of what this means, consider the primitive technology of smoke signals. While I do not know exactly what content was once carried in the smoke signals of American Indians, I can safely guess that it did not include philosophical argument. Puffs of smoke are insufficiently complex to express ideas on the nature of existence. And even if they were not, a Cherokee philosopher would run short of either wood or blankets long before he reached his second axiom. You cannot use smoke to do philosophy. Its form excludes the content. A 4-inch piece of metal and glass that buzzes, flashes, and rings cannot adequately mediate an education. Its form excludes the content. Nor can it, I might add, since this is the season of our country, nor can it effectively mediate public policy. tweets issued at 3 a.m. from the Oval Office hardly suffice. That was a little jab. Okay, he won. I grant you. Nor did I vote for Kamala, by the way. I did a write-in for the American Solidarity Party. Any form up to the job has to be able to correspond to what we are ontologically, what we were made to be. And that is creatures. Creatures made for communion. Creatures with a creator. Now, because we are the kind of creatures we are, we're aware of alienation, a rupture of communion, a painful separation from God and from men. This alienation is expressed in the creation accounts of every culture. We experience anxiety, we experience restlessness. But the structure of our person orients us toward reunion. We try to reduce anxiety. We pacify ourselves by any number of means. Augustine tried to quiet his disturbed spirit through, among other things, sensual indulgence, devotion to philosophical movements. Even the Platonists' love couldn't do it quite. Immersion in strange religions, strange doctrines and practices. But none would do, because none could accurately diagnose the problem or prescribe a remedy. And the problem is finitude coupled with infinite longing. No human being, no finite creature can solve this, or as Wittgenstein put it, the problem of time and space has to be solved outside of time and space. We have a deep longing, an infinite longing for integration of ourselves as bodies, minds, and spirits, and communion with the source, the creator, the living God. As Augustine famously says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. The restlessness is a longing to know and to love, to be known and to be loved. This is the existential foundation of a profound pedagogy. A restless longing to know and to love, filled with desire. This is eros. And the experience of eros is disquieting. It's painful. But it must be felt to propel a search, like the search, the quest that Augustine undertook in the 5th century. A search for that which alone satisfies it. And if there isn't something commensurate to it, then one is left with a stoic alternative of apatheia, and I don't think that's adequate. I don't think it suffices. It strikes me that almost every engine of our culture intends to short-circuit the trajectory of eros, to manipulate it, to capitalize upon it, to somehow harness the dynamism of eros while blinding us to its proper end. Social media, the smartphone, the metaverse. At root, the kind of driving existential and psychological engine behind all of this, it seems to me, especially behind technological saturation, is anxiety. It's an attempt to flee our situation. Digital media, as used by most people most of the time, is an attempt to escape from where we are and who we are with. Sometimes, depending upon the company, it's completely understandable. I have to say, if I may, this is an admission, and I don't even know that I've ever admitted this to my husband, but if on occasion when my husband and my children are away, I am vulnerable to a doom loop of conversion stories on EWTN. I kid you not. I once stayed up until 2 in the morning watching conversion stories from the journey home on YouTube. Okay, I can tell you about about 100. And by the end, I was left in total despair. Okay, so we want to escape. We want distraction from who we are, where we are, who we're with. But if the metaverse isn't real, at the end of the day, when the grid goes down, when you actually have to shut off your laptop, we're left with us. We're left here. We're left in humble little Hyattsville. We have to reckon with Hyattsville. Might be different in Florence, but I mean, even that only goes so far. We're left with us. But that's the only game in town. That's the only place where we can love and be loved. And that scripture comes to mind, this very day salvation has come to this house. Education must correspond to reality and use instruments adequate to human beings. Instruments that can gauge the height and depth and breadth of the human. Charlotte Mason, a British educator at the turn of the century, I should say at the turn of the last century, when I think increasingly the turn of the century means partying like it's 1999. Well, she was partying like it was 1899. And she observed that there were only 3 instruments worthy of a genuine education, and they were summed up in her great motto: education is an atmosphere, a discipline, a life. Education is an atmosphere. The atmosphere of the home and the school should promote order and wonder through an encounter with real things. Mason was a great proponent of nature study, of careful observation, of being out in the world, of looking at beautiful art, of listening to beautiful music, of hearing stories read aloud. And the kind of backbone of the education would have been for her books, encounters of the best thoughts of the best minds. So a rich and varied education is what she proposed in this atmosphere that fostered wonder. But all of this would be for naught, she insisted, if it weren't accompanied by discipline. For her, the home and the school are ordered so as to cultivate good habits. And in particular, the sort of foundational habit for her was the habit of attention. We have to learn to attend. Remember that great line from The Death of a Salesman: attention must be paid. Attention must be paid. We have to learn to pay attention. Atmosphere and discipline then allow you to live, and to live well. The self-possession afforded by good habits and the offerings of a well-cultivated atmosphere leave us with the possibility of a real life and an abundant life that's rich and interesting and engaged. It's interesting, when Charlotte Mason established her teaching college at Ambleside, she had a very eager young student, a woman probably in her early 20s. And Mason asked her, "Why have you come here?" And she said, "I've come to learn how to teach." And Mason said, "No, you've come to learn how to live." So even the pedagogues need to learn how to live. And there's something very hopeful in that, to my mind, which we'll get back to. So for Charlotte Mason, she talks about the desire to know. So she's digging into the classical and the Christian tradition. If that desire to know is cultivated, if it's recognized and cultivated, it leads to life-giving communion. For her, she said, education is the science of relations. It's relating everything. We can do this. Let's go back to the problem that Neil Postman identified, and Huxley before him. If we created this, there is a possibility that we can uncreate it. If we cultivate the right atmosphere and cultivate the discipline of attention, and I would add to the discipline of attention, as it were, the discipline of presence, of actually being with. And relatedly, the discipline of space. I've always been struck by the vow of stability in monastic orders. It's crucially important for the life of their community because they need to be dedicated to a place. They are persons in place. It's only if we have this sense of attention and presence that we can delve deeply into the best thoughts of the best men. And in that view, and in that vein, let me appeal to the work of two great poets. The one who I think diagnoses the problem, and the other who offers at least the root of a resolution. Wordsworth, writing in 1807, so the turn of not last century, but the one before. The world is too much with us. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything we are out of tune, it moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. To which Stevenson gives this answer. The world is so full of a number of things, I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings. Thank you.